Clinton's offer to remove Syria from the list of states sponsoring terror if Damascus agreed to U.S.-Israeli peace terms. When Syria insisted on recovering territory seized by Israel, the Clinton State Department kept the country on the terrorism list. Nonetheless, Syria had been highly cooperative in providing important intelligence to Washington on al-Qaeda and other radical Islamist groups. Implementation of the Syria Accountability Act deprived the United States of an important source of information about radical Islamist terrorism. Obtaining such information, however, is clearly subordinate to the goal of establishing a regime in Syria that would accept U.S.-Israeli demands. Had Syria been removed from the list of states supporting terror, it would have been the first since 1982, when the Reagan administration removed Saddam, so that they could provide him with substantial aid, joined by Britain and many others. That again tells us something about the attitude toward terror and state crimes. A core demand of the Syria Accountability Act refers to UN Security Council Resolution 520, which calls for respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon. Syria had definitely violated the UN resolution by keeping its forces in Lebanon, forces that the United States and Israel had readily accepted in 1976, when their task was to massacre Palestinians, and again in 1990, when the United States was building a coalition to support the coming war in Iraq. This passed in silence, and Congress and the media also neglected to point out that the original Security Council resolution, passed in 1982, was directed against Israel, the only country named in the resolution. There was no call for sanctions against Israel, or for reduction in the huge unconditional military and economic aid it receives, when Israel violated this and other Security Council resolutions regarding Lebanon for 22 years. The principle is very clear. Middle East scholar Stephen Zunes writes, "Lebanese sovereignty must be defended only if the occupying army is from a country the United States opposes, but is dispensable if the country is a U.S. ally." Another illustration of the single standard, not restricted to U.S. policymakers, of course. A side observation. By a 2-to-1 margin, the U.S. population favors an Israel Accountability Act, holding Israel accountable for development of WMDs and human rights abuses in the occupied territories. That is consistent with other studies of public opinion, scarcely reported, though plainly of considerable importance in a democratic society. Outside the Middle East, too, there are numerous illustrations of the low priority assigned to the war on terror. One is the Bush administration's attitude toward the 9/11 Commission Congress established to recommend means to prevent new terrorist atrocities. Over its lifespan, Philip Sheehan reported, the September 11th Commission repeatedly clashed with the Bush administration, which had originally opposed its creation, especially over the panel's access to important White House documents and to witnesses. A year after its final report was presented, Commission members formed a bipartisan 9/11 public discourse project to pressure the government to implement its recommendations to prevent terrorist attacks. The recommendations were largely ignored. Particularly worrisome, argued Thomas Keane, who chaired the official 9/11 Commission, was the failure to make any serious effort to secure nuclear material, the central element of a program to prevent the nuclear terror that intelligence analysts regard as otherwise inevitable. The project's report, issued 4 years after 9/11, found that the Bush administration and Congress had made minimal or unsatisfactory progress on 8 of 14 recommendations by the 9/11 Commission for overhauling the government to deal with terrorist threats. Shortly before the London train and bus bombings of July 2005, the U.S. Senate sharply cut funding for rail and mass transit security. The 9/11 Commission had called for a national transportation security strategy, but that remained among the 50% of the 9/11 Commission's specific recommendations a year ago that Congress and Bush have yet to act upon. Boston Globe columnist Thomas Oliphant wrote, "Part of the unholy alliances between industry and government to avoid taking measures to protect against potentially catastrophic terrorism that is not difficult to imagine. Tax cuts for the rich rank far higher as a priority than protection of the population from terror." A still more ominous example of the negligence in security matters, Oliphant continues, is the success of the chemical industry and its White House contacts to block stiff rules requiring security upgrades at some 100 chemical plants around the country. Congressional efforts have encountered nothing but industry and administration obstacles in their attempts to force a sensible approach to guarding against disasters that might make 9/11 pale by comparison. Senator Joseph Biden cited a study by the Naval Research Laboratory that estimated that as many as 100,000 people in a densely populated area could die within 30 minutes if a single 90-ton freight car carrying chlorine were punctured, Oliphant reported, concluding that conniving between the Bush administration and its corporate buddies has blocked any action. The administration is even trying to overturn a court decision supporting a local ban on shipments of the most dangerous chemicals from certain zones around the nation's capital. All of this illustrates how low the priority of preventing terror is in comparison with corporate welfare. To select an illustration from another domain, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, is tasked with investigating suspicious financial transfers, a central component of the war on terror. In April 2004, OFAC informed Congress that of its 120 employees, 4 were tracking the finances of Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, while almost 24 were enforcing the illegal embargo against Cuba. From 1990 to 2003, OFAC conducted 93 terrorism-related investigations that led to $9,000 in fines, and 11,000 Cuba-related investigations that led to $8 million in fines. The revelations received the silent treatment in the United States, though there was a mention in the national press that at the time when the United States faces very real terrorist threats in the Middle East and elsewhere, the administration's absurd and increasingly bizarre obsession with Cuba is more than just a shame. It's a dangerous diversion from reality. Senator Max Baucus deploring the misuse of taxpayer money to punish Cuba. The Bush administration's real priorities are further illustrated by its handling of the leak of the name of CIA agent Valerie Plame, after her husband, Joseph Wilson, published an unwelcome report undermining administration charges about Iraq's alleged purchases of yellow cake from Niger for its WMD program. Retired CIA agents informed Congress that U.S. intelligence gathering was damaged not only by the leak, but even more by the administration cover-up, which caused irreversible damage to the credibility of our case officers when they tried to convince an overseas contact that their safety is of primary importance to us, said Jim Marcinkowski, a former CIA case officer. Each time, the political machine, made up of prime-time patriots and partisan ninnies, display their ignorance by deriding Valerie Plame as a mere paper pusher, or belittling the varying degrees of cover used to protect our officers, or continuing to play partisan politics with our national security. It's a disservice to this country, he added, harming efforts to prevent terrorist attacks. As the example illustrates, protecting the country is also a far lower priority than maintaining tight top-down control, as in tyrannical corporate structures. The Cheney-Rumsfeld team, for which Bush is the front man, has shown repeatedly that it is obsessed with authority and discipline. The ruling clique